So, hello and welcome back once again as we jump back into Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, where I think Lydia came off way better than she honestly should have. I do feel at least slightly vindicated that I was right and it was all Mr. Darcy's doing, although he doesn't seem to be maybe like speaking to Elizabeth as much, or at least Elizabeth thinks he isn't, although it might just be one of those cases of she's too embarrassed to look at him because she feels bad about him basically paying off Wickham. And he might also be feeling a little too embarrassed to look at her because, she already rebuked him once. Is that a word, rebuked, or is it rebuffed? I don't know. The perils of reading many a word but never really hearing them said. We need to change language a little bit. Bring back some old words like kerfuffle and shindig. Shindig's a good word. I don't know. I'm in a weird mood today. It snowed. We did not get 6 to 12 inches. If you saw my video this morning, we got maybe 2. I mean, I can deal with 2 inches of snow. If it wants to do that, a couple times a week, that's fine. I can deal with that. It's when we get like 10 or 11 inches all at once, then it becomes much harder to deal with. So small increments periodically, fine. I'm not nearly as excited about the idea of the kind of below zero temperatures that are supposed to be coming. That's not as much fun. We can skip that. Let's stay in the 30s. She says, knowing full well that she lives in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and we get very, very cold. But you know what? I can still wish. Like, we can have a nice winter where we get an appropriate amount of snow, but still don't get into the like negative 20 Fahrenheit. Sounds good to me. Anyway, enough of all that, because it is time to jump back in and do another 2 chapters of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We are diving back into Volume 3, beginning with Chapter 12. As soon as they were gone, Elizabeth walked out to recover her spirits, or in other words, to dwell without interruption on those subjects that must deaden her spirits more. Mr. Darcy's behavior astonished and vexed her. Why, if he came only to be silent, grave, and indifferent, she said, did he come at all? She could settle it in no way that gave her pleasure. He could still be amenable, still pleasing to my uncle and aunt when he was in town. Why not to me? If he fears me, why come hither? If he no longer cares for me, why stay silent? Teasing, teasing man. I will think no more about him. Her resolution was for a short time involuntarily kept by the approach of her sister, who joined her with a cheerful look, which showed her better satisfied with their visitors than Elizabeth was. Now, she said, now that this first meeting is over, I feel perfectly easy. I know my own strength, and I shall never be embarrassed again by his coming. I am glad he dines here on Tuesday. It will be then publicly seen that on both sides we meet only as common and indifferent acquaintance. Yes, very different indeed, said Elizabeth laughingly. Oh, Jane, take care. My dear Lizzie, you cannot think me so weak as to be in any danger now. I think that you are in very great danger of making him as much in love with you as ever. They did not see the gentleman again till Tuesday, And Mrs. Bennet, in the meanwhile, was giving way to all the happy schemes which the good humor and common politeness of Bingley in a half-hour's visit had revived. On Tuesday there was a large party assembled at Longbourn, and the two who were most anxiously expected, to the credit of their punctuality as sportsmen, were in very good time. When they repaired to the dining room, Elizabeth eagerly watched to see whether Bingley would take the place which, in all of their former parties, had belonged to him by her sister. Her prudent mother, occupied by the same ideas, forbore to invite him to sit by herself. On entering the room, he seemed to hesitate, but Jane happened to look round and happened to smile, and it was decided he placed himself by her. Elizabeth, with a triumphant sensation, looked towards his friend. He bore it with noble indifference, and she would have imagined that Bingley had received his sanction to be happy, had she not seen his eyes likewise turned towards Mr. Darcy with an expression of half-laughing alarm. His behavior to her sister was such during dinner time as showed an admiration of her, which, though more guarded than formerly, persuaded Elizabeth that if left wholly to himself, Jane's happiness and his own would be speedily secured. Though she dared not depend upon the consequence, she yet received pleasure from observing his behavior. It gave her all the animation that her spirits could boast, for she was in no cheerful humor. Mr. Darcy was almost as far from her as the table could divide them. He was on one side of her mother. She knew how little such a situation would give pleasure to either, or make either appear to advantage. She was not near enough to hear any of their discourse, but she could see how seldom they spoke to each other, and how formal and cold was their manner whenever they did. Her mother's ungraciousness made the sense of what they owed him all the more painful to Elizabeth's mind, and she would at times have given anything to be privileged to tell him that his kindness was neither unknown or unfelt by the entire family. She was in hopes that the evening would afford some opportunity of bringing them together, that the whole of the visit would not pass away without enabling them to enter into something more of conversation than the mere ceremonious salutation attending his entry. Anxious and uneasy, the period which passed in the drawing-room before the gentlemen came was wearisome and dull to a degree that almost made her uncivil. She looked forward to their entrance as the point on which all her chance of pleasure for the evening had to depend. "If he does not come to me then," she said, "I shall give him up forever." The gentleman came, and she thought he looked as if he would have answered her hopes, but alas! The ladies had crowded round the table where Miss Bennet was making tea, and Elizabeth pouring out the coffee, in so close a confederacy that there was not a single vacancy near her which would admit a chair. And on the gentleman's approaching, one of the girls moved closer to her than ever, and said in a whisper, "The men shan't come and part us, I am determined. We want none of them, do we?" Darcy had walked away to another part of the room. She followed him with her eyes, envied everyone to whom he spoke, had scarcely patience enough to help anybody to coffee, and then was enraged against herself for being so silly. A man who has once been refused, how could I ever be foolish enough to expect a renewal of his love? Is there one among the sex who would not protest such a weakness as a second proposal to the same woman? There's no indignity so abhorrent to their feelings. She was a little revived, however, by his bringing back his coffee cup himself, and she seized the opportunity of saying, Is your sister at Pemberley still?" "Yes, she will remain there till Christmas." "Quite alone? Have all her friends left her?" "Mrs. Annesley is with her. The others have been gone on to Scarborough these 3 weeks." She could think of nothing more to say, but if he wished to converse with her, he might have better success. He stood out by her, however, for some minutes in silence, and at last, on the young lady's whispering to Elizabeth again, he walked away. When the tea things were removed and the card tables placed, the ladies all rose, and Elizabeth was then hoping to be soon joined by him, when all of her views were overthrown by seeing him fall victim to their mother's rapacity for whist players, and in a few minutes after seated with the rest of the party. She now lost every expectation of pleasure. They were confined for the evening at different tables, and she had nothing to hope but that his eyes were so often turned towards her side of the room as to make him play unsuccessfully as she was. Mrs. Bennet had designed to keep the 2 Netherfield gentlemen to supper, but their carriage was unluckily ordered before any of the others, and she had no opportunity of detaining them. "Well, girls," she said, as soon as they were left to themselves, "what say you to the day? I think everything has passed off uncommonly well, I assure you. The dinner was well dressed as any I ever saw, the venison roasted to a turn, and everybody said they never saw so fat a haunch. The soup was 50 times better than what we had at the Lucases last week, and even Mr. Darcy acknowledged that the partridges were remarkably well done, and I suppose he has 2 or 3 French cooks at least. And my dear Jane, I never saw you look in greater beauty. Mrs. Long said so too, for I asked her whether you did. And what do you think she said besides? Mrs. Bennet, we shall have her at Netherfield at last. Yes, she did indeed. I do think Mrs. Long is as good a creature as ever lived, and her nieces are very pretty behaved girls, and not all handsome. I like them prodigiously." Mrs. Bennet, in short, was in very great spirits. She had seen enough of Bingley's behavior to Jane to be convinced that she would get him at last, and her expectations of advantage to her family, when in a happy humor, were so far beyond reason that she was quite disappointed at not seeing him there again the next day to make his proposal. "It has been a very agreeable day," said Miss Bennet to Elizabeth. "The party seems so well selected, so suitable to one another. I hope we may often meet again." Elizabeth smiled. "Lizzie, you must not suspect me. It mortifies me. I assure you I have now learnt to enjoy his conversation as an agreeable and sensible young man, without having any wish beyond. I am perfectly satisfied from what his manners now are that he never had any design of engaging my affection. It's only that he's blessed with greater sweetness of address and a stronger desire of generally pleasing than any other man." "You are very cruel," said Elizabeth. "You will not let me smile, and you are provoking me to it at every moment." "Oh, how hard it is in some cases to be believed," said Jane. "And how impossible in others." "But why should you wish to persuade me that I feel more than I am acknowledging?" "That is a question which I hardly know how to answer, Jane. We all love to instruct, though we can teach only what is not worth knowing. Forgive me. And if you persist in indifference, do not make me your confidant." And that is the end of chapter 12. And now, on to chapter 13 of volume 3. A few days after this visit, Mr. Bingley called again, and alone. His friend had left him that morning for London, but was to return home in 10 days' time. He sat with them above an hour, and was in remarkably good spirits. Mrs. Bennet invited him to dine with them, but with many expressions of concern, he confessed himself engaged elsewhere. "Next time you call," she said, "I hope we shall be more lucky." He should be particularly happy at any time, and if she would give him leave, he would take an early opportunity of waiting on them. "Can you come tomorrow?" Yes. He had no engagement at all for tomorrow, and her invitation was accepted with alacrity. He came, and in such very good time that the ladies were not even dressed. In ran Mrs. Bennet to her daughter's room in her dressing gown, and with her hair half finished, crying out, "My dear Jane, make haste and hurry down. He is come, Mr. Bingley is come, he is indeed. Make haste, make haste. Here, Sarah, come to Miss Bennet this very minute, and help her on with her gown. Never mind Miss Lizzie's hair." "We will be down as soon as we can," said Jane, "but I dare say Kitty is forwarder than either of us, for she went upstairs half an hour ago." "Oh, hang Kitty! What has she got to do with it? Come, be quick, be quick! Where is your sash, my dear?" But when her mother was gone, Jane would not be prevailed on to go down without one of her sisters. The same anxiety to get them by themselves was visible again that evening. After tea, Mr. Bennet retired to the library, as was his custom, and Mary went upstairs to her instrument. 2 of the 5 obstacles being thus removed, Mrs. Bennet sat looking and winking at Elizabeth and Catherine for a considerable time without making any impression on them. Elizabeth would not observe her, and when at last Kitty did, she very innocently said, "What's the matter, Mamma? Why do you keep winking at me for? What am I supposed to do?" "Nothing, child, nothing. I did not wink at you." She then sat still 5 minutes longer, but unable to waste such a precious occasion, she suddenly got up, and saying to Kitty, "Come here, my love, I want to speak to you," and took her out of the room. Jane instantly gave a look at Elizabeth, which spoke her distress at such premeditation, and her entreaty that she not give in to it. In a few minutes, Mrs. Bennet half opened the door and called, "Lizzie, my dear, I want to speak with you." And Elizabeth was forced to go. "We may as well leave them by yourselves, you know," said her mother as soon as she was in the hall. "Kitty and I are going upstairs to sit in my dressing room." Elizabeth made no attempt to reason with her mother, but remained quietly in the hall till she and Kitty were out of sight, then returned to the drawing room. Mrs. Bennet's schemes for this day were ineffectual. Bingley was everything that was charming, except the professed lover of her daughter. His ease and cheerfulness rendered him a most agreeable addition to their evening party, and he bore with the ill-judged officiousness of her mother, and heard all her silly remarks with a forbearance and a command of countenance that was particularly gratifying to the daughter. He scarce needed an invitation to stay to supper, and before he went away the engagement was formed, chiefly through his own and Mrs. Bennet's means, for his coming the next morning to go shooting with her husband. After this day, Jane said no more of her indifference. Not a word passed between the sisters concerning Bingley, but Elizabeth went to bed in the happy belief that all must speedily be concluded, unless Mr. Darcy returned within the stated time. Seriously, however, she felt tolerably persuaded that all this must have taken place with that gentleman's concurrence. Bingley was punctual to his appointment, and he and Mr. Bennet spent the morning together as had been agreed upon. The latter was much more agreeable than his companion expected. There was nothing of presumption or folly in Bingley that could provoke his ridicule or disgust him into silence, and he was more communicative and less eccentric than Mr. Bingley had ever seen him. Bingley, of course, returned with him to dinner, and in the evening Mrs. Bennet's invitation was again at work to get everybody away from him and her daughter. Elizabeth, who had a letter to write, went into the breakfast room for that purpose soon after tea, for as the others were all going to sit down to cards, she could not be wanted to counteract her mother's schemes. But on returning to the drawing room, when her letter was finished, she saw to her infinite surprise that there was reason to fear that her mother had been too ingenious for her. On opening the door, she perceived her sister and Bingley standing together over the hearth, as though engaged in earnest conversation, and, had this led to no suspicion, the faces of them both as they hastily turned round and moved away from each other would have told it all. Their situation was awkward enough, but hers, she thought, was still worse. Not a syllable was uttered by either, and Elizabeth was on the point of going away again, when Bingley, who, as well as the others, had sat down, suddenly rose, and whispering a few words to her sister, ran out of the room. Jane could have no reserves from Elizabeth where confidence would give pleasure, and instantly embracing her, acknowledged with the liveliest emotion that she was the happiest creature on the earth. "It's too much," she added, "by far too much. I do not deserve it. Oh, why is everybody not as happy?" Elizabeth's congratulations were given with a sincerity, a warmth, and a delight which words could poorly express. Every sentence of kindness was a fresh source of happiness to Jane, but she would not allow herself to stay with her sister, or say half of that remained to be said for now. "I must go instantly to my mother," she cried. "I would not on any account trifle with her affectionate solicitude, or allow her to hear it from anyone but myself. He is gone to father already. Oh, Lizzie, to know that what I have to relate will give such pleasure to all my family! How will I bear such happiness?" She then hastened away to their mother, who had purposely broken up the card party and was sitting upstairs with Kitty. Elizabeth, left by herself, now smiled at the rapidity and ease with which the affair was finally settled, that affair that had given them so many months of suspense and vexation. "And this," she said, "is the end of all his friend's anxious circumspection, all of his sister's falsehood and contrivance, the happiest, wisest, and most reasonable end." In a few minutes she was joined by Bingley, whose conference with her father had been short and to the purpose. "Where is your sister?" he said hastily as he opened the door. "With our mother upstairs. She will be down in a moment, I dare say." He then shut the door, and coming up to her, claimed the good wishes and affection of a sister. Elizabeth honestly and heartily expressed her delight at the prospect of their relationship. They shook hands with great cordiality, and then, till her sister came down, she had to listen to everything he had to say of his own happiness and Jane's perfections, and in spite of his being a lover, Elizabeth really believed all of his expectations of felicity to be rationally founded, because they had for the basis the excellent understanding and the super excellent disposition of Jane, and a general similarity of feeling and taste between both Jane and Bingley. It was an evening of no common delight to them all. The satisfaction of Miss Bennet's mind gave a glow of such sweet animation to her face as made her look more handsome than ever. Kitty simpered and smiled and hoped that her turn was coming soon. Mrs. Bennet could not give her consent or speak her approbation in terms warm enough to satisfy her feelings, though she talked to Bingley of nothing else for half an hour. And when Mr. Bennet joined them at supper, his voice and manner plainly showed how really truly happy he was. Not a word, however, passed his lips in allusion to it until their visitor took his leave for the night, but as soon as he was gone, he turned to his daughter and he said, "Jane, I congratulate you. You will be a happy woman." Jane went to him instantly and kissed him and thanked him for his goodness. "You are a good girl," he replied, "and I have great pleasure in thinking you will be so happily settled. I have not a doubt of your doing very well together. Your tempers are by no means not alike. You are each of you so complying that nothing will ever be resolved upon, so easy that every servant will cheat you, and so generous that you will always exceed your income." "I hope not. Imprudence and thoughtlessness in money matters would be unpardonable in me." "Exceed their income, my dear Mr. Bennet!" cried his wife. "What are you talking of? Why, he has 4,000 or 5,000 a year, and very likely more." Then addressing her daughter, "Jane, oh my dear Jane, I am so happy. I am sure I shan't get a wink of sleep all night. I knew how it would be. I always said it must be so. So at last I was sure you could not be so beautiful for nothing. I remember as soon as I ever saw him when he first came to Hertfordshire last year, I thought how likely it was that you should come together. He is the handsomest young man that ever has been seen." Wickham and Lydia were all forgotten. Jane was beyond competition now her favorite child. At that moment she cared for no other. Her youngest sisters soon began to make an interest with her for objects of happiness which she might in the future be able to dispense on them. Mary petitioned for the use of the library at Netherfield, and Kitty begged very hard for a few balls there every winter. Bingley, from this time on, was of course a daily visitor at Longbourn, coming frequently before breakfast, and always remaining till after supper, unless when some barbarous neighbor, who could not be enough detested, had given him an invitation to dinner, which he thought himself obliged to accept. Elizabeth had now but little time for conversation with her sister, for when he was present, Jane had no attention to bestow on anyone else, but she found herself considerably useful to both of them in those hours of separation that must sometimes occur. In absence of Jane, he always attached himself to Elizabeth for the pleasure of talking to her, and when Bingley was gone, Jane constantly sought the same means of relief. "He has made me so happy," she said one evening, "by telling me he was totally ignorant of my being in town last spring. I hadn't believed it possible." "I suspected as much," said Elizabeth, "but how did he account for it?" "It must have been his sister's doing. They were certainly no friends to his acquaintance with me, which I cannot wonder at, since he might have chosen so much more advantageously in so many respects. But when they see, as I trust they will, that their brother is happy with me, they will learn to be contented, and we shall be on good terms again, though we can never be what we once were to each other." "That is the most unforgiving speech," said Elizabeth, "that I have ever heard you utter. Good girl, it would vex me indeed to see you again the dupe of Miss Bingley's pretended regard." "Would you believe, Lizzie, that when he went to town last November, he really loved me, and nothing but a persuasion of my being indifferent would have prevented his coming down again. He made a mistake, to be sure, but it is to the credit of his modesty, said Elizabeth. This naturally introduced a pharyngenic from Jane on his diffidence and the little value that he put on his own good qualities. Elizabeth was pleased to find that he had not betrayed the interference of his friend, for though Jane had the most generous and forgiving heart in the world, she knew it was a circumstance which must prejudice Jane against him. "I am certainly the most fortunate creature that has ever existed," said Jane. "Oh, Lizzie, why am I thus singled out from my family and blessed above them all? If I could just see you as happy, if there were but another such man for you." "If you were to give me 40 such men, I could never be so happy as you. Until I have your disposition, your goodness, I will never have your happiness. No, let me shift for myself, and perhaps if I have very good luck, I may meet with another Mr. Collins in time." The situation of the affairs in the Longbourn family could not be very long a secret. Mrs. Bennet was privileged to whisper it to Mrs. Phillips, and she ventured, without any permission, to do the same to all of her neighbors in Meryton. The Bennets were speedily pronounced to be the luckiest family in the world, although only a few weeks before, when Lydia had first run away, they had generally been proved to be marked out for great misfortune. And that is the end of chapter 13. All right, so Jane is getting her happy ending, and that's good, although I don't think that we have heard the last, considering there's still a few chapters, and I'm sure we need some more intrigue. So I am thinking that we have not heard the last of Miss Bingley, our resident mean girl. So if I'm going to make a prediction now, I'm going to say that Miss Bingley is going to pop up and do something to try to throw a monkey wrench into the whole affair. And I'm not exactly sure what's up with Mr. Darcy, but I guess we shall have to wait and see. Also, Mrs. Bennet annoys me. I'm not even gonna lie about that. Mrs. Bennet, I would not do well with a mother like her. I mean, we all have our own trials and tribulations with family, but I don't think I could, I don't think I would like Mrs. Bennet as a mother. I would like a sister like Jane, though, somebody that sees the good side in everybody. I think maybe she carries it too far, but it's still a good quality to have, and it's a quality I probably should try to have more often. Anyway, a little bit short tonight, but that is the way things shake out sometimes. Thank you, as always, for listening. I hope that you enjoyed those 2 chapters. Yay, Jane's engaged. That's 2 of 5 that Mrs. Bennet has now managed to hopefully marry off, so good for her, question mark? Anyway, leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile and supposedly does good things for the algorithm or something. I don't even know how YouTube works, but it does make me smile, and that's the one thing I care about. Thank you, and I will see you guys tomorrow for another 2 chapters.